The makers of Octopath Traveler are back once more with their latest game, Triangle Strategy, a game so good and innovatively named that you can't help but wait for their latest and next game, such as, I don't know, square dancing and circle racing. Ho ho ho, very droll. But also, specifically, yes, the makers of Octopath Traveler are back once more with yet another hot, velvety injection of liquid nostalgia. Yes, Triangle Strategy resurrects the long-lost genre of isometric strategy games that you might have necessarily remembered from your childhood with games like Final Fantasy Tactics and Disgaea, Gaia. And, more importantly, it uses the HD 2D graphical system to make Triangle Strategy look basically exactly as you'd possibly remember those classic games looking. Yep, exactly the same. You take the role of Serenoa, a young lordling of the House Warfort, going about your business in a land of tenuous peace with the ever-present backdrop of a terrible war from 30 years ago, grounded in the limited availability of salt. This is why I'm the big bucks. Oh god. Oh no. As you go about your day-to-day lordling antics, you'll be thrust headfirst into the adult world of politics, deception, and warfare. Partly because your dad has a heart attack.
This will be the last night I will hear those. My lord.
Whoops! But you'll have to do everything in your limited power to learn of the ways of the world, and more importantly, learn the ways of the other nations of this land as they all make subtle plans and ploys to seize power. You'll have moments where you get to press the flesh with the common folk, and you'll run around gathering useful intel and information. And all of this, alongside some of the wider reading you can do, is increasingly vital to be able to handle this world. These are the local exchange rates of currency. This is every noble lord and lady that you'll need to know the name of. These are the major imports and exports of every nation. You need to learn all of this. Yikes! Triangle Strategy does not hold your hand when it comes to dealing with the complexities of geopolitics and foreign relations. In fact, it plants you firmly face first into the world and rapidly demands you understand the trade negotiations required to handle the Duchy of Acefrost.
A discovery of this magnitude could reshape all of Norzelia.
This leads to a couple of issues, namely that the game immediately barrages you with so many names of senators, prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, as well as their personalities, their political ideologies within their own nation, as well as what they wish to achieve in the world and the governances in which they oversee. It's a bit much, and you will rapidly hope that maybe we could get a little bit of a recap on some of this information. And that will never come, because the game has quickly shuffled onto the next dramatic revelation. This game has a lot of cutscenes, like an alarming number of cutscenes. They never really end, and that can possibly be an issue.
I have no objections.
As these cutscenes play out, with characters long-windedly monologuing about something or other, they will eventually fade to black, and you'll think it's time to engage in something else. But the biggest twist in these games isn't the political intrigue, it's that there's always another scene for you to watch. These can be fine. There's a lot of drama in this political drama.
Damn them! Please let my family be safe.
A lot of proclamations of virtue, honor, and resolve. But also, there's a lot of knocking the player with an ever increasingly blunt object for them to understand what's happening, leading to an odd instance where the story is simple enough to follow, but well overtrodden. And the world building is dense, but only really established in the first few moments. There could, let's say, be a moment where a new character from a foreign nation is introduced and joins your party, and you definitely think they're probably a bit suspicious. You might even think, well, they're a bit of a spy. But before your thought is given the time to fully manifest, the immediate next scene is that character reporting to their superiors like the little spy that they are. Triangle Strategy is almost so desperate to tell its story in a particular way and to make sure you're aware of that it is afraid to let the player contemplate anything themselves for even the smallest amount of time.
Here, here!
Here, here!
But at the same time, when the credits rolled on my playthrough of the game, I realized I really liked it, as well as the story. Like, the boring milquetoast characters that I started out with had grown into something that was more interesting and engaging. Their convictions had finally bubbled to the surface and grown stronger. And despite everything being overly melodramatic at possibly every single moment of the game, it is still a story grounded in humanity itself and is all the more engaging for it. It's a JRPG. I spent a lot of the game thinking, this is where we start killing God. Because that is what JRPG stories do. You kill God. It is the natural conclusion of any narrative. And yet, that never actually came. Instead, the game is consistently a story about the human aspect of war and people constantly trying to inflict positive change on the world, stand up for what they want and protect their loved ones and what they believe in from a war they want no part in. And it's great. Speaking of war, there's a lot of it. The world rapidly gets thrown into conflict and war before you can even get a single lick of salt. Oh, not again! Why? And most of this war takes place in the strategy world of a strategy game.
Take this!
Your amalgam of units are placed on a map of various layouts, and it's up to you to achieve victory, which normally involves killing everything that isn't yourself, but can sometimes involve taking down a commander, seizing a bridge, or sneaking to a location. The combat is quite fun and interesting. While it starts out quite simple, you'll unlock enough different and odd units in time that you'll no longer simply run to the enemy and hit them with a stick. Although that is what I did a lot of.
I'll make this quick!
But you might also summon forth a rainstorm to create puddles on the ground and then follow that up with a furious lightning strike to tear through anyone and everyone with soggy shoes.
Stay down!
This is a combat system that involves moving your units around and then doing an action. And as levels get more involved, so do your considerations. Do you want to have a character charge in, knowing that they'll get peppered to death like so many Boromirs from the archers above? Or maybe do you want to split off and hope to do a pincer move?
Time to die! I see your every opening.
The speed in which combat can turn against you is surprisingly quick. So without some careful thought and planning, you'll find yourself being backstabbed and skewered from all sides in no time. Which sucks, especially as that was your plan.
Now! Did you see that?
The combat and their systems are incredibly solid. While a lot of the starting characters you have are very simple, you rapidly begin to unlock new, odd, and interesting ideas for characters. Like, I unlocked a blacksmith who had like a pushing trap and could also create ladders to scamper up the walls on. And I'll be honest, every mission rapidly became a Home Alone style assault as I aimed to personally ruin these people's day. All of this, alongside the very limited resources that you have at hand, means that upgrading your party's weapons and various bits and pieces actually requires some level of contemplation because you are always so limited for bits and pieces and the costs rapidly stack up that, well, it becomes a bit of an issue. And while you don't necessarily suffer for not upgrading things quick enough, at the same time, when you're trying to choose between who gets an upgrade and who doesn't, It's like trying to choose between your favourite children, except they all have knives. You're a real terrible parent. But overall, the combat is quite simple, which is great because it means a certain level of complexity can rise up from that simplicity. Because it's not a game that is about abusing systems to create something wildly overpowered or some ridiculously intense combo where all sorts of things happen all at once, like some previous games might do. Because basically, if your character begins to get stronger, well, eventually you'll find that the enemy can do everything that you can do too. And it's always a bit of a struggle. In fact, most of the difficulty and complexity comes about through unit placement and how you move them about through these ever-changing and varied maps, as well as the potential need for war crimes. Oh god, this makes me feel bad. Yes, in the continuation of a world and story where war brings out the worst in us all, we're all just trying to be better than that. The game gives you many choices and will force you to live with them. It's actually the main through point of the game. The scales of conviction are frequently brought up in which you ask your closest chums to decide on your next path.
State your case before the scales of conviction. Then we shall decide our destination.
This can be as simple as where do we want to go and have a nose about, to something more complicated like do we give someone up to the enemy to probably be executed? And it is up to you to try and sway your friends one way or the other. This system is both parts exceptional and frustrating due to just how obtuse it is. Serenoa's own personal convictions slowly build through your various actions during the story, and you never really have any idea on how, beyond knowing that he thinks exclusively in morality, liberty, and utility. But a lot of the dialogue options you'll come across aren't exceptionally clear on how they affect what, which is great as you're just forced to follow things through as you would possibly go about doing them. You can't necessarily just power game the system. This then bleeds through to trying to convince your friends to do something, as your arguments hold more sway depending on the personality of the character, the argument you're making, and your own convictions. This, paired with all the information you've managed to pick up along the way, can make trying to persuade anyone onto a particular point quite difficult. An example. At one point, Benedict suggested a plan of doing a big war crime, and I didn't really want to do this. I tried my best to convince everyone around me that the war crime would be bad. But I lost, and we did it, and I felt bad. I felt so bad that I reloaded my game, looked up a guide on what to say, then did that. But it turned out my Serenoa was still not convincing enough despite saying the right things. Listen, I know Benedict's plan seems like it could work, but it just doesn't seem right. You know, there's a lot of human suffering at play here, and I think that's quite bad. I hear what you're saying, my lord, but I don't like the way you're saying it, so I'm gonna have to vote in favour of the war crime. Who would have done this war crime? Oh, there's genuine human suffering at play here. Oh, we're ravaged by this war crime. This might seem like it's a bit annoying because the game's not doing what I wanted it to do. But it's actually really good because it's a constant reminder that I needed to try harder to get what I want, and also that the systems actually worked. They weren't just a superfluous stopgap where I had to just do a thing because they came up with a mechanic and a menu system. Instead, I had to convince these characters who all have different things, and it made them feel like actual characters. The game actually does very little to do any of that throughout the game though, because throughout the main story your characters are little more than handfuls of tropes and don't really have any sort of major development outside of specific key plot points, which is still nice, but overall a bit naff. But you do have a number of side characters, and if you use them enough side scenarios, where you get like the backstories of these characters. It's kind of interesting. Like Nav, as an example, a plucky young mage where he is the apprentice to some long-lost magician that no one has ever heard of, the Grandante. And you'd assume, eventually, you'll learn all about who this Grandante is. There is something to be said how the game will pepper you with endless quantities of side scenes, optional side scenes, all relating to the main story that aren't actually required because it's just really hammering that nail home. But at the same time, all of your side characters that you get that aren't part of that core story group are just kind of left to rot because they're not given any chance to have any major scenes throughout the entire game. So they feel like they exist in a separate universe. I want to know more about Nav. I want to know more about Jens. I want to know more about these characters. You could have cut out so many of these side scenes about the main story and just slapped in more actual things about the characters, so I care about the characters when I'm sat through long scenes. Overall, Triangle Strategy was surprisingly pleasant. Sure, it stumbles immediately out of the gate, but quickly picks itself back up and starts blasting you with an interesting story of politics and intrigue and war.
These are trying times, but we mustn't let emotions cloud our judgment.
And it's a story that kept me mostly engaged. And the combat is solid and simple enough that you have so much room to experiment within it and create all sorts of interesting situations. Sure, there are instances of long cutscenes, and it will routinely feel like you are just, at times, loading up one cutscene after another. But you know, you could just do something at the same time, like, I don't know, catch up on your laundry or something. The HD 2D style is delightfully impressive and merges 2D sprites and stylistic 3D diorama maps wonderfully. And while I think I heard about 4 songs primarily for long periods of time throughout the game, there are brief moments where a new song will kick in, and it absolutely slaps.
Prince Roland, finally you return.
At ease, Huette.
It's a JRPG. It suffers from JRPG style writing, where, you know, the story is actually good, actually quite interesting, and I was surprised and impressed where my story took me. But at the same time, it has that anime style of writing where there is so much heavy exposition at every possible turn that will possibly put some people off.
'Tis not worth going into detail.
But overall, Triangle Strategy is really quite good, and I actually want to play through it all over again to see like the other parts of the story, see where the other bits of the story take me, because they seem to be very different. Although I'm literally never going to be siding with Benedict. Absolutely hate that guy. Can't stand him.
You brought that pendant with you? Of course. It is the only memento I have of my mother.